and welcome to the Common Hour. My name is Rachel Anderson Rayburn, and I'm the chair of the Common Hour Committee and Associate Professor of Theater. I'd like to introduce our ASL interpreter, Cindy Mees. Thank you, Cindy. Please note that if you need to change your screen view to include Cindy as you watch, you can adjust the screen display mode in the small box labeled View towards the upper right of the Zoom window. During today's event, Zoom viewers can submit questions for our speaker via the Q&A feature at the bottom of the Zoom screen. Please identify yourself as an FPS member or a student. We don't use anyone's name. Note that there will be a virtual reception for Professor Rauser following the Common Hour, hosted by Ware College House. You can drop in to offer congratulations or stay and ask her about her work. The Zoom link and passcode will be posted in the chat. Our virtual pizza server group today is the F&M chapter of Be the Match, a national nonprofit that works with families and patients who are diagnosed with leukemia, lymphoma, and other life-threatening diseases. For these patients, a bone marrow transplant or a blood transplant may be their best and only option for a cure. In order to obtain a transplant, a patient needs to find their match. Be the Match facilitates simple cheek swab drives on campus and has registered more than 150 people so far this year. Be the Match meets every Wednesday on Zoom at 8:30 p.m. and is always looking for new members. And now, so that she may introduce Professor Amelia Rauser, I'd like to introduce Alexis Castor, Professor and Department Chair of Classics.
Thank you, Rachel. I'm Alexis Castor, and on behalf of myself and my fellow nominator, Professor Lee Franklin of the Philosophy Department, it is my pleasure to introduce Amelia Rauser as the recipient of the 2020 Bradley R. Dewey Award. I am going to use 3 terms from the F&M love language to introduce our colleague to this Common Hour audience: rigor, connections, and peer review. First, rigor, perhaps the greatest love language at F&M. Amelia is the 30th recipient of the Dewey and the 6th female scholar. The Dewey Award singles out one who best exemplifies the ideal scholar, whose research inspires excellence and enlightens teaching. Professor Rauser's research centers on 18th century British and French art, with a focus on how men and women of that era constructed their public selves, using nonverbal cues such as dress and hairstyle to present, or sometimes to conceal, their true identity, ideas resonant today on social media. Her 2008 book, Caricature Unmasked: Irony, Authenticity, and Individualism in 18th Century English Prints, shows how caricaturists simultaneously mocked and envied the figures they lampooned. Professor Rauser's most recent book passed muster through the rigorous review at Yale University Press, where it was deemed a beautifully written and intelligent fusion of art history and fashion history, and a worthy addition to Yale's prestigious catalog. In the age of undress, art, fashion, and the classical ideal in the 1790s, in the age of undress, art, fashion, and the classical ideal in the 1790s, she credits women with using their clothing to represent crucial intellectual trends of the day. A reviewer in fashion theory praises this work as bringing a fresh perspective and notes the sensitivities to race and colonialism that she brings to bear on well-known works of art. A more popular peer review came when New York Times cooking blogger Sam Sifton recommended it to his readers in December 2020, along with honey roasted peanut thumbprint cookies as not to be missed. The second F&M love language, connections. Professor Rauser's research and teaching explores the deep interconnectedness of art and society. A recent article co-authored with a historian of medicine, examines how the pernicious disease tuberculosis became chic in the 1790s. In her Art of Democracy course, cross-listed with government, students investigate how structures of power shape art and architecture to represent changing cultural ideals. Her work with colleagues to create the Examined Life Connections course, which won an NEH Enduring Questions grant, embeds visual studies together with literary and philosophical texts in this first semester course to prepare students for their college career in the liberal arts. International connections come in the form of a Fulbright Nehru Professional Excellence Scholar Grant at St. Teresa's College in Kochi, India. She recently completed a term as president of the Historians of 18th Century Art and Architecture, where she oversaw the creation of the organization's first blog and hired a social media intern to run its Instagram account. These interdisciplinary links within and outside of F&M have helped center art in daily life for her students and colleagues. Finally, the third love language, peer review. In her time at F&M, Amelia has been elected by her faculty colleagues to the Professional Standards Committee, Educational Policy Committee, Faculty Council, and the Curriculum Review Steering Committee. She has been asked to serve on search committees for several senior administrators and was co-director of the Humanities Initiative. Her wide experience within the college continues in her current role as Associate Dean of the Faculty, where she undergoes rigorous peer review daily. Her mastery of these F&M love languages has enriched many of us in Lancaster and elsewhere. Amelia Rauser is a groundbreaking scholar at the forefront of her field and richly deserves this moment of recognition and love by Franklin and Marshall College.
Oh my goodness, that's the best introduction in the whole world from one of the best people in the whole world. Thank you so much, Alexis, for my dear companion and friend who's walked pretty much every step of my research journey with me, oftentimes sharing apartments in strange cities while I was visiting fashion archives. So thank you so very much. And thank you for having me today. It's really a great and wonderful opportunity to address my colleagues and our students. I'm going to share my screen now, and this is always something that an art historian is lucky to do, to be able to hide behind wonderful objects. So I want to talk today about research that grew from my teaching. And here are a few photographs of our dear students doing the paper couture project, which is a project that I teach in the History of Fashionable Dress course. And this was a project that I got the idea from my dear colleague, Ginny West, our costume designer in the theater and dance department, who had this idea and suggested it to me when I was looking for a way for students to deal with the materiality of dress in their own way. And I credit my students here for the direction that my research took, because I was not trained as a fashion historian, and it was really through exploring the history of fashionable dress with my students in teaching that I realized I was keen to solve a certain problem. Why on earth did women suddenly shift from looking like this, wearing outfits, dresses, costumes like this, to looking like that? This is a shift that happened pretty rapidly in the late 18th century, and it's a pretty stunning transition. What happened? What had to change in the culture to allow women to go around dressed like this? My research has always been motivated by a fascination with and a desire to dignify the aesthetic choices of ordinary people. Each one of us is participating in the aesthetic of our moment. What is it that you like? What are you choosing? What bedspread did you choose for your bed? How did you decorate your room? And why are you wearing that? In making choices like these, we're participating in the visual culture of our time and place, just like the painters and sculptors and architects around us are. Now, I'm not saying a bedspread is exactly as interesting or enriched as a painting is, but then again, it might be. We maybe just need to look closely. Maybe we need to learn more about that bedspread before we dismiss it as something that's insignificant or unworthy of sustained attention. Maybe the person who made it or used it is a person whose voice wouldn't be heard any other way. Indeed, textiles like this quilt have often been the primary way for women to engage with the aesthetic ideas of their era. There have been great women artists, of course, but in almost every time and place on Earth, most women have been excluded from high status aesthetic and intellectual life. When their aesthetic output has been studied, it's mostly been as craft, material culture, or folk art, a stream of aesthetic production that stands apart from the high art culture innovated by mostly male artists. So maybe let's think about that bedspread or a painted fan like this one, or a stitched gown. Let's think about those objects for a minute and think about what we can learn from them. In my own work, I simply begin from the assumption that the aesthetic lives of ordinary people matter and that their engagements are profound and meaningful and worthy of study. My research uncovers and argues for the significance of those engagements. And to overcome skepticism, I lay out reams and reams of evidence and interpretation in order to connect seemingly insignificant objects, things that people might have overlooked as frivolous or ephemeral, things like political caricatures or illustrated magazines or white high-waisted dresses. I want to connect these things to important ideas and events in history, indeed the most important and prestigious ideas and events, if I can make it happen. When I was first starting out as a scholar, this approach was somewhat controversial. Work that focused on marginal objects was thought to be pretty marginal itself. And it was only through a combination of cluelessness and obstinacy that I was able to complete an art history dissertation on political satire in the American Revolution, centering my interpretation of these prints on prestigious intellectual concepts of the Enlightenment, such as liberty and representation. And I'm showing you a great one here from 1776, a personification of Great Britain battling a personification of the Americas. And the America figure is saying, "Liberty, liberty forever, mother, while I exist." And her mother is saying, "I'll force you to obedience, you rebellious slut." So that was a good one. But I'm not going to talk about that stuff today. But young people today, like you, my dear students, who I hope are watching, you don't need this explained to you. You don't need it explained to you that style matters or that aesthetic ideas have deep meaning. You fully embrace the idea that our aesthetic choices not only express elements of selfhood and identity, but also values, ideas, and commitments. But for fellow old people in the Zoom room, are you familiar with hashtag aesthetics? These are entryways to entire communities, worlds, and worldviews. Perhaps you learned about hashtag cottagecore by reading about it in the New York Times last spring. It's also spawned the recent sea shanty craze, which you may have heard about because that made it even to Facebook and celebrities and The Tonight Show. Hashtag aesthetics are a key way for young people in our culture today to really be expressing themselves. There is an aesthetic wiki, in which you can log on and create your own aesthetic and enumerate its qualities. Some of my favorite ones are Dark Academia. This is a particular favorite. And this is a sort of style board, a mood board that shows the different features of this aesthetic. And there are hundreds of these. They encompass not only clothing choices, but interiors, activities, musical playlists, all things that work toward a sort of world creation that is meant by these hashtag aesthetics. People write into the wiki to the Q&A section, and they're asking for help. They list their affinities and things they like, and they say, "What's my aesthetic? Help me identify it." And that's a question that means far more, of course, than what's it like or what's it fashionable to wear right now. It goes straight from aesthetics to identity and values. Maybe you're a plant mom. And this has led to a lot of interesting memes and trends lately. This is one from recently where There was a trend on TikTok and Instagram, post your last 5 non-face emojis as a way to discover your aesthetic. And this led one recent Twitter user to ask, "Bitch, what aesthetic is this? 9 months pregnant, eating a cinnamon roll in my car, listening to Judy Garland." I think cottagecore is one of the most interesting hashtag aesthetics of this moment because it's also a site of contestation. On the one hand, the rural, analog, handcrafted world it evokes has been embraced by the so-called trad wives movement, a right-wing online community of women, mostly in the US and UK, who embrace traditional homemaking and subservience to their husbands. And this group is connected to white nationalism via an emphasis on increasing the birth rate of white children. But on the other hand, cottagecore has many queer and lesbian adherents. For them, this aesthetic encompasses an ideal space of female sociability and solidarity, a realm of subsistence and barter outside capitalist exchange, and a discursive realm that centers women. Recalling the lesbian separatists of the 1970s, cottagecore enthusiasts commune online and celebrate traditionally female skills of embroidery, baking, gardening, weaving, and preserving. But cottagecore is also self-critical and exploratory. There's an active discussion about decolonizing cottagecore, questioning its romanticization of a rural past built on lands seized from Indigenous people, and claiming it as a space of connection and expression for people of color. If you're interested in destabilizing the gender binary, you might also be more interested in the offshoot goblin core, which is like cottagecore, but tending more towards mushrooms and overalls. The point is, hashtag aesthetics are not frivolous escapism, or at least not only that. They're ways to imagine an ideal future world, to build alliances toward enacting that vision, to frame your body in harmony with your identity, and to place that body in a space, physical or virtual, where it can thrive. In that spirit, I would say that my recent work on fashionable dress in the 1790s is basically hashtag bacantic neoclassicism. I argue that the women in the 1790s engaged in these dress practices were engaged in a kind of world building and world imagining by appropriating the visual language of neoclassicism. They wore thin white muslin dresses to construe themselves as sculptures come to life, thereby inserting their own bodies into the most prominent artistic, philosophical, and scientific discourses of their moment, and turning their disadvantages, that women were considered less cultured, more sensitive, closer to nature, and more tied to their physical bodies, into advantages. So for the next part of this presentation, I want to explain this idea a little bit more by giving you a detailed example of one part of my argument. And then after that, we can have a nice Q&A and talk about whatever you want. What I'm going to focus on today is one part of my research that's been deeply affected by being immersed in a liberal arts college setting at Franklin and Marshall. And that is what fashionable dress can tell us about contemporary theories of cognition, health, and the science of life. I don't think I ever would have written this chapter if I hadn't had the good fortune to come to work at F&M with so many brilliant colleagues in the life sciences, psychology, religious studies, classics, philosophy, and anthropology, with whom I've had the honor to speak and work and think alongside for almost 18 years now. And so, my dear colleagues, this is for you, and thank you. In the 1790s, elite women appeared in ballrooms, gardens, and opera boxes dressed as living statues. In this French print, a couple embraces in a garden while another woman adjusts their postures in imitation of the Cupid and Psyche marble sculpture near them on a pedestal. All the figures are wearing neoclassical dress, the women in white muslin, the man in the tight breeches and cutaway coat that articulated a classical bodily ideal for men. The marble Psyche is nude except for a drape around her hips, which the human Psyche imitates with her fashionable cashmere shawl. But where the sculpture is nude, the human body is clad with white muslin. The textile represents nude, flawless, white marbleized flesh, and the human figures embraced with the beauty of statues come to life. If we take seriously this contention made frequently by contemporaries that the neoclassical dress of the 1790s was intended to make women look like living sculptures, then we must ask, What exactly does it mean to enact or embody a work of art? And why might women have wanted to do so? What's behind this fascination with bringing artwork to life? Or alternatively, with stilling and marmorializing it. That's a word that I love that means turning things into marble, marmorializing their bodies into sculptures. I want to suggest that the vogue for transparent white neoclassical dresses in the 1790s was not merely a fad for things antique or simply a matter of expressing revolutionary ideals connected to the French Revolution, as scholars have sometimes said, but rather it was linked to broader concerns in neoclassical aesthetics and to the Enlightenment science of life, which was based on the theory of vitalism and its valorization of embodied cognition. Vitalist aesthetics, which rooted the intellectual apprehension of beauty in physical sensation and posited the entire sensate body as an engine of cognition, provided both inspiration and justification for neoclassical dress. Vitalism, which conceived the life force as being dispersed throughout the body, entailed a notion of entangled or embodied cognition. Scientists and physicians were concerned with the mystery of life and whether the boundary between animate and inanimate matter might in fact be permeable. Enlightenment epistemology, with its widespread rejection of innate ideas, cultivated instead a kind of sensationism, and the notion that all knowledge was derived from the senses was shared by diverse thinkers across the spectrum of 18th century thought, from Condillac to Rousseau to Adam Smith. In this pervasive view, the body is largely independent of the conscious mind. It runs on reflex and is self-regulating. It receives and processes sensation into cognition, largely without an overall governing authority, such as the brain. This view was particularly associated with the faculty of the famous Montpellier Medical School in France, for whom the term vitalism was invented around 1800. But before that year, they primarily used the term sensibility to describe this idea. And this concept, sensibility, was a key concept in their holistic view of the functioning of both body and mind. For these thinkers, the living statue was a frequently invoked thought experiment. Imagine a statue coming to life. How does that happen? All at once, like a miracle? Or slowly growing in sensitivity and knowledge? What they're asking is, what makes living, animate beings different from inanimate matter, bodies rather than statues? And furthermore, what makes them sensible organisms rather than mere machines? In answering these questions, Enlightenment thinkers split between metaphysical and vitalist explanations for the spark of life. While Descartes had posited an immortal, rational soul distinct from the machine of the body and linked directly to God, vitalists were skeptical of the idea of a separate soul. For them, all matter was either imbued with self-organizing life or had the potential to be. Through natural sympathy, even inanimate objects could perhaps be invested with life, emotion, and consciousness. The vitalist life force then surged through all animated living things and might even be imagined to enliven inanimate ones with the right spark. One effect of this theory was that it retrieved the so-called clay cottage of the body from centuries-old Christian condemnation. The body had long been suspect as decaying and a depraved temporary house for the eternal soul, and its senses were a source of temptation and moral corruption. As attested in the tradition of the Vanitas still life, the pleasures of the flesh and of the senses, including music for the sense of hearing, food and drink for the sense of taste, textiles and erotic pleasures for the senses of touch, had long been regarded as dangerous to the virtuous person who aimed for eternal life. In still lifes like this, the candle is guttering out and the health of your eternal soul is always at odds with the sensations of the body. But in this new way of thinking in the 18th century, the body was invested throughout with vitalist life force, and its sensations were the very stuff of moral, intellectual, and physical knowledge. Cultivating those senses didn't only increase pleasure, it increased understanding, knowledge, and cognition. And those who were the most attuned to sensations then were not only the most alive, but also those who possessed the greatest capacity for learning and knowledge. Well, guess who had long been accused of being overly sensitive and at the whim of their bodies? You guessed it. Women were perceived to be among the least stony of humans in these terms as a result of their longtime association with emotionalism, sensibility, and embodiment. This idea is expressed visually in this British mezzotint made after a painting by George Romney called Sensibility. It features the mimosa, also called the sensitive plant. The mimosa actually does shrink back when touched. It's a plant that's native to Central America. Romney's scene represents a woman reaching out and touching this plant, using the exquisite sensitivity of the sensate body as a vehicle for cultivating the sensitive soul. And we can see a similar gesture in this print from about the same time, also called Sensibility. This young girl reaching out to touch a snail who's going to recoil from her touch. These prints place women and children on a continuum with other lower living things with which they're able to commune. But also, crucially, they laud the brute vitality of these animals, plants, and women and children as a source of natural virtue. And that means that they're portraying virtue as natural to life, not the product of dogma or the gift of grace. And they're portraying women as having perhaps a privileged access towards that natural virtue. Vitalist ideas thus challenge the nature of life itself and posited that with the right nudge, life might spark the inanimate into animation. For a parallel iconographic exploration of these ideas of animation and the breath of life, many turned to two figures from antiquity, Psyche and Pygmalion. Connected metaphorically with both the soul and the breath of life, Psyche, or in Latin, anima, was awakened by love and desire, animated from a death-like stupor into life, and eventually into immortality. Psyche's story was a tale of personal endurance and ultimate triumph. I don't have time to tell you the whole story here, but let me say it, there's a lot of parallels to Disney's Beauty and the Beast, complete with dancing candlesticks and feasts that serve themselves in magical castles. Although she was hidden, blinded, abandoned, and enslaved, at the end of the story, Psyche gained her freedom and became immortal by empowering her own desiring gaze. She defied the gods and dared to look. And you can see her in this disobedient moment in the Blake etching that I'm showing you on the left, where Psyche is pulling back the drape and looking at her lover, which she was definitely not supposed to do. In the 1790s, Psyche was a very popular figure that was used across visual culture. Psyche yoked beauty and desire to soul, animation, and the breath of life, and served as a compelling representation of the way living statues, with their exquisite sensitivity and perception, could connect contemporary vitalist notions of life science with the pluck and courage of a curious woman who dared to look. Similarly, the Pygmalion story took on renewed force in the 18th century. It was featured in many of the most innovative theatrical productions of the age, and it was painted and sculpted by numerous artists across the century. This story usually stands in as a story about the creation of art and the elevation of man, humans, but men in particular, as creators of art, as quasi-divine, godlike creators, and in which their sculptures, their artworks can come to life. And yet it's also in that sense, and now we know from our discussion already today, it's a fantasy about the possibilities for vitalist aesthetics. In this painting by Girodet on the right, I'm showing you a detail from this painting on the right, the artist approaches his sculpture with the same sensitive fingers we saw in the mimosa plant. But instead of the sensitive mutual recoiling that we imagine happening with the woman and the mimosa plant, here we expect the spark of life to leap the gap, the statue to live, and the couple to fall into an embrace. What sparked Pygmalion's Galatea, his sculpture, to life was his desire for her. And indeed, desire plays a paramount role in the vitalist aesthetic theory of the 18th century. Philosophers like Winckelmann, Lessing, and Herder were all preoccupied with explaining how the work of art achieved its sense of coming to life in the eyes of the spectator. Winkelmann's sensuous descriptions of the beauty of Greek sculpture used tactile language to create an effect of enlivening as you're reading his discussion of the Apollo Belvedere, the sculpture I'm showing on the right. You're imagining that sculpture coming to life and you're imagining communing with that sculpture. So he's using language and imagination to establish the connection between sight and touch. For him, the erotic attraction of classical sculpture was a starting point for a transcendent experience of beauty, virtue, and excellence. Well, I've come a long way from dresses, but I'm gonna land the plane now. I want to argue that neoclassical fashion engages with this aesthetic theory in particular, and with vitalist thought more generally, by thematizing the contour of the body, the way that it interfaces with the world through the skin. The transparency of neoclassical dress veiled the body, whitening it, and thereby seeming to present it in an intermediate state between marble and flesh, animate and inanimate. The use of a thin muslin textile for these dresses caused them to pool elegantly around the figures who wore them, providing a continual variety in the patterns of pleating and draping, much as marble drapery does for classical figure sculpture. And most importantly, the dress's skimpiness removed inhibitions to sensation, allowing nearly the entire body to interact with the world. Neoclassical dress thus thematized the skin as a sensitive, perceptive interface. Drawing on the connection between sensibility, heightened nervousness, and the purity of perception, neoclassical dress construed its wearers as exceptionally astute, awake, artistic, and virtuous, firing with embodied cognition. Now, on the one hand, the lighter and less restrictive garments that were part of neoclassical fashion facilitated more robust movement and greater liveliness, physical liveliness, a quality that was recognized not only in street fashion, but also on the stage. And you can see a satire here by James Gilray of the revealing new costumes that were being employed by ballet dancers and the new athletic poses that they facilitated. In this painting, in painting as well, vigorousness was sometimes represented with a heightened flush to the cheek. On the other hand, many argued that by removing inhibitions to sensation and increasing the interface between the skin and the world, neoclassical dress made women not more vigorous and healthy, but more susceptible to disease. One French physician called neoclassical dress the costume that will depopulate Paris of its young women, and described an epitaph on a marble tombstone he saw that mourned the death of a young woman, quote, victim of murderous fashion. But it was not only mere exposure to cold or fluctuating temperatures that could lead to muslin disease, that is a bad cold or flu, but also the sensitivity of the exposed skin, it was believed could shade a person, such disease could shade muslin disease into consumption or tuberculosis. That's consumption was the 18th century name for tuberculosis. Now, if you could wear giant muffs and fur tippets, that might protect you from the cold somewhat, but the bare arms and the bums and legs of neoclassically clad women still made tempting targets for Jack Frost, as we see here in an 1803 satire. The filmy skirt of the woman in the center allows us clearly to see her stockings and garters and her bare posterior pinched by the talons of frost. And the doggerel underneath says, the shape of her frame by each gale was revealed, while a slight robe of muslin her beauties concealed. This woman paid dear for the fashion, her folly and pride, went home to her bed and there lingering died. Well, why would women wear clothing that endangered their health? I want to say this may have been a feature, not a bug. Tuberculosis is a terrible disease, but in the 18th century, it was considered a disease that tended to strike the young, beautiful, sensitive, and artistic. And in turn, its effects were thought to increase the beauty of a woman before she died. And so following this, some women actually embraced and emphasized the consumptive chic of their neoclassical dress. As my friend and collaborator, Carolyn Day, has argued, the small, low-cut back bodices of neoclassical dress drew attention to the distinct vertebrae and projecting shoulder blades that were the telltale signs of the consumptive woman. And the physical ideal for women in this period was extremely thin. And I hope you're enjoying my Bridgerton reference I was able to wedge in here, because although I have many things to say about the dress in this production, which we can talk about in the Q&A, the physical ideal of Daphne is definitely right on target. Very thin, very pale, very white. The exquisite sensibility of the tubercular woman implied not only aesthetic refinement, but also moral virtue. And also reciprocally, the more virtuous and sensitive you were, the more likely you were to come down with consumption. The glamour of consumption then, and its associations with sensibility, vital energy, and the mysterious oscillation between animate and inanimate further inflected women's self-styling as living statues. One last artwork, and then I'll stop. In this portrait by Denise Villers of Charlotte Valnognes, the young artist sits at work in front of a cracked window. Her fashionable neoclassical dress with its high waist and tucked fichu skims her torso and then falls in soft gathers. The contours of her legs are articulated by the folded cloth that puckers, pulls, and flows from her waist to the floor. Villers makes the unusual choice of backlighting the woman, creating startling lighting effects. The light from the window highlights the peaks of each fabric fold and shines through the wispy curls on the sitter's head, giving it the appearance of a glowing corona. Most notably, the sitter's bodily contour radiates with light, its edges not crisp, but rather fuzzed out and blurred. This effect both emphasizes her bodily contour, silhouetting her white body, flesh and muslin, against the dark wall behind. And yet it also gives a sense of this boundary as a vibrating membrane that interacts with the world around it. Analogizing the woman and her art, her portfolio is also a dark form surrounded by a glowing white border. The paper on which she draws extends beyond the black support and catches the light. That her eyes, those traditional windows to the soul, are shadowed reinforces the sense that it's the woman's body, shimmering with light and vibrating with energy, that is the place of cognition and sensibility here, glowing with life as she concentrates on her art. Constructed by the artist as not just an object of the artist's gaze, but as a subject as well, the sitter, with her fuzzed, glowing borders, is animated by her own sensibility, a living statue pulsing with vitalist energy and creating not just herself, but also her art. Getting dressed is an aesthetic decision that you and I make every single day, and one that situates our bodies in time, space, and culture. Fashion is discursive. That means it's responsive to the expression of others, and it makes no sense without being imbricated in a reciprocal field of utterances. Thus, despite the fact that fashion articulates individual human identities with a particular age, status, season, and occasion, and despite the importance of a few fashion innovators in inventing and disseminating fashion change, and despite the other fact that choosing clothing feels like an idiosyncratic expression of personal style, fashion nonetheless situates each of us in relation to one another. As in #cottagecore, it can be harnessed to help us imagine a better, fairer, more just, more interesting, or more beautiful world for our bodies to inhabit. And by looking closely at fashion, we can gain insight into the values and aspirations of those who spun it, wove it, sewed it, marketed it, and wore it, peoples whose voices are often difficult to hear. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you so much, Amelia. It's wonderful. And I would love to be the voice passing some questions from our audience to you. So the first question is from a faculty member, and they say, quote, "Fabulous presentation. Beyond hashtags, how do you think the intersection between non-fungible tokens or NFTs, fashion, and aesthetics might play out?" digital applications have already distanced fashion from our bodies. NFTs are now redefining concepts of ownership and identity. Will we figure out a way to wear NFTs?
Wow, what a fabulous question. I have no idea how to answer that, but it's a wonderful thing to think about. I'm just learning about NFTs. They are very confusing to me, but that's just my problem. I need to figure them out. Our bodies, I think we all have a fairly attenuated relationship to our bodies right now. We're living through screens and connecting through screens all the time. As you know, for the past year, that's all we've done. And, you know, fashion in that context is really fashion from here up. What we're wearing below, we don't see, and it makes us wonder how much it matters. The extension from that way of thinking about ourselves to thinking about imbricating ourselves in digital interfaces or expressing ourselves through digital tokens like these NFTs, it makes complete sense. I mean, it's another expression of the sort of hashtag aesthetics, another way to sort of imagine, build out a world in which you can imagine inhabiting yourself. And there's also a fundamental contradiction there, which exists also in the hashtag aesthetics, which is these hashtag aesthetics are mostly online worlds. They're mostly online communities, but they bear a relationship to the physical world. In other words, I get a sense that people want their physical world to resemble this online world that they're imagining and creating, and they're taking steps to do it, but it's obviously more aspirational than it is reflective. And I wonder, and so to that extent, it makes me wonder which is the more important. You know, again, as an old timer, I think about the online world as being a mere reflection or sort of a pale shadow of what is actually happening. But I don't think that the young people of our world think of it that way. And especially in the last year, this online world, this online community has gotten more and more real and more important.
It makes me think about how if we're imagining what hashtag aesthetics do as aspirational, makes me think about how that there's something that exists in that space that doesn't exist in the physical world, even if it's modeled from it.
Mm-hmm.
We have another question from a student. What impact do you think Marie Antoinette's muslin chemise à la reine had on the neoclassical silhouette and aesthetic?
That is a fabulously learned question. Thank you, dear student. I'm delighted to get that question. It did have an effect. So what the student is describing is a white muslin dress that was popular in the 1780s. It used the same textile as neoclassical dress. It had a different silhouette, a slightly different silhouette. It had a natural waist and a full skirt. It didn't have that very high waist, high tight back and columnar skirt that's part of neoclassical dress. It was a very elite style because in that it took a lot of muslin. It was heavily ruched and gathered. It took a lot of yardage, and the muslin that was used to make it was fine imported Indian muslin, which was fabulously expensive. And the first thing that happened when you put that dress on is it immediately got dirty and ruined. So only the wealthiest people could really afford to wear it. And that's why it was perfect for Marie Antoinette, because it appeared, it had a signification on the surface of being a sort of country dress that you would wear in the garden. And in fact, she had herself portrayed wearing this dress, holding a basket of roses as if she had just come in from outside. It also, by its name, resembled the name robe à la reine, but also was known as the robe en chemise. That name is referencing the underdress that you would wear under one of those formal gowns that I showed at the start, your underdress. So basically it's an underwear is outerwear look, but the most fancy, expensive kind. Totally fabulous, perfect for Marie Antoinette. Not accessible for more regular women, but did have an influence, especially on the adoption of muslin as the textile, because a lot of those glamorous significations of that textile translated onward into the neoclassical dress that came about 10 years later.
This, I think, sets us up nicely for the next question from a student. To what degree were evolving ideas about class at play in these stylistic evolutions?
That's a great question. It's difficult to answer. I'm mostly in my research talking about elite women because those are the ones who could afford to dress the way that they wanted. And however, it's not as cut and dried as it might appear. So on the one hand, I want to acknowledge I'm mostly talking about elite women. On the other hand, the economy of dress and how it moved among classes, social classes, is very interesting and dynamic. So dresses would be given by mistresses to servants. They would be resold and remade. There was always for centuries a lively trade in secondhand and used clothing because textiles have always been very expensive, much more expensive than they are today with machine-made textiles. And the neoclassical dress in particular was easy to make yourself. And so this is something that differentiates it from earlier styles. Earlier styles were mostly about the textile. They're about showcasing a very expensive, finely crafted textile made of silk, with very high levels of craftsmanship and decoration. It's about showcasing the textile. Neoclassical dress, the textile is important, that white muslin's important, but it's mostly about creating a silhouette. And so it's mostly, the focus of the neoclassical dress is on creating this certain shape and having that body shape occupy and move through the world in a certain way. That shape is pretty easy to achieve. You can make a neoclassical dress yourself if you have even rudimentary sewing skills. I've made myself one and they're fun to make. They're mostly closed with drawstrings and pins. They're simple, they don't take a lot of yardage. And so they were accessible, more accessible than earlier fashions had been. And also that meant that women had more of them. You know, it would be common with earlier styles, you would have very few numbers of garments because they were so expensive. Neoclassical dresses, you might have many of them. They're made of cotton. They're much more accessible and they take less yardage.
This is a third question from a student. Where could one go to learn more about the implications and roots of hashtag aesthetics in style and fine art, apart from your classes, which are of course the obvious answer?
Well, I mean, I would actually love to talk with that student more. This is, honestly, I've learned about this through my own children. And I see how they engage with it, and it's very, very interesting to me. And so I've just been, you know, poking around in this online world of hashtag aesthetics to learn about it as a primary source. That's all I know, except for what was in the New York Times, which I showed you. There are a lot of articles actually being written about this in various journals, but it's a history that's yet to be written. And so maybe you, dear student who raised that comment, will be the person to work on that and write that history.
This is a question and comment from a staff member. Quote, "Thank you for the excellent presentation. I'm wondering if you could speak further to the effects of colonialism and increased demand for Indian muslin on the production of the fabric and requisite appropriation of muslin by Europeans." And also related from a faculty member, muslin came to Europe from India, what is now Bangladesh. I wonder if you might comment on the importation of aesthetics from the East along with its cotton.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you for those questions. And this area is a major focus of my book, that these white neoclassical dresses are white, racialized white as well. There is a whole side to this that imbricates these bodies in a racial hierarchy and that situates the classical past and racializes that somewhat for the first time. As a racialized classical past. And the material origins of the textile are one way in which we can bring this history to life. So I feel like this is one way in which really looking closely at these overlooked objects tells us things that looking at the paintings makes it easy to overlook. But it's hard to overlook when this cotton is grown by enslaved people in the West Indies and imported to Liverpool and spun there and woven there and then sold for women to wear. Or when that's the sort of cheaper muslin. The fancier muslin is being grown and woven in India and Bangladesh, current day Bangladesh, and brought by the East India Company and imported. And so it is the most desirable product of colonialism. And furthermore, the Industrial Revolution happened because of textiles. That was the main thing. That was the first industrial product, was textiles. So these textiles, the desire for muslin, the desire for a cheaper product to compete with India, drove the Industrial Revolution and technological innovation, and it drove colonialism, and it drove the plantation and enslavement economy in the West Indies as well. So these things are crucial to uncover. Stylistically, it's also very much involved with colonialism. And so I have a lot of stuff to say, which I'll just give a very short version of here, about how the style of neoclassical dress, yes, it's influenced by Marie Antoinette's dress, as we said earlier. It's also influenced by the white round gown that was worn by enslaved and free people in the Caribbean. They wore muslin round gowns. A round gown means a dress you put over your head rather than one you put your arms into like a bathrobe. And it was a style that worked well in the climate of the Caribbean, and it became sort of, uncomfortably fashionable because of its connection to slavery and plantations. Many of the most fashionable women in Paris, including Josephine, who later married Napoleon, came from plantations. They were the daughters of plantation owners in the West Indies. That was the source of their wealth. That was the source of their glamour. And they brought these and appropriated these elements of Caribbean dress practices, including not only the round gown, but also plaid madras cloth, which is still a feature of West Indian dress today, which was imported from India, from Madras, and was part of the triangle trade that was used to clothe enslaved people. It's this plaid cloth. Well, that became a fashionable accessory in Europe, even though it was a banned textile in Europe, because the Europeans wanted to protect their own textile markets. So it's a very tangled story, but a super interesting story that shows that these neoclassical dresses, their neoclassicism, as I've tried to argue, and their connection to science and to aesthetics was absolutely there and absolutely crucial. But layering on top of that, or along on one layer or another, is this whole history, this whole story of colonialist exploitation and of a growing sense of racial hierarchy, and and women were using the dress to do that as well.
Banned textiles. That's so interesting.
Yes.
It's very hard for me to be quiet and go to other people's questions, but I'm going to make an effort. Mm-hmm. This is a question from a student. What was the reaction of older generations of women to these new styles?
That's a great question. I mean, they were definitely scandalous. And interestingly, it was not the bare breasts that was so much of a problem. To us, that's the most scandalous part. But actually, bare breasts are all over the place in the 18th century. It was really the bare arms that was scandalous, to have, as some became sleeveless or had very sheer sleeves. The exposure of the arms and of the back, that was the more shocking thing. It's an unforgiving style. It's a style that really favors a sort of extremely thin young person. And in fact, it's a style that's somewhat connected to the pinafore that was worn by children of both sexes in the 18th century. So it's kind of an infantilizing style as well. That makes women with childlike bodies are sort of the ideal body to wear this style. And so all of those things made it unforgiving for older women as a fashionable style, as well as being somewhat scandalous. Yeah.
This is from a faculty member. I'd like to ask about the last painting. I was wondering if you think she seems burdened and weary, slumped over rather than vibrant. And thank you for your wonderful talk.
Thank you for your comment. I mean, it's an interesting painting. The window behind her is cracked, and there is on the far parapet a couple, it's only like this big, tiny in the distance, who are looking at her. So there have been different interesting interpretations of this painting and what it means, but I really don't see her as burdened. I see her as an artist who has a studio space in the Louvre. That's one thing that scholars have determined, is that this space that's shown, the interior, is an artist studio, and artists were granted studio space in the Louvre in the 18th century, but you had to be lucky to get one, and she's got a spot and she's doing her work. To me, that's a tremendously exciting picture of a woman at work.
Another question from a faculty member. You talk about how these women imitated statues. And I wonder about how today some people seem to be making canvases out of their whole bodies. Is there a theoretical difference between non-permanent fashions like clothing and more permanent fashions such as tattoos?
Oh, that's a great question. I mean, there's the question of permanence and impermanence, and there's the question of form versus surface as well. I think that's the thing that interests me about tattoo culture, is that it is such, a lot of times there is an attention to form in terms of the placement and design of the tattoo, but it's primarily about surface. It's primarily about altering the surface of your body. And in that sense, it is a kind of interesting analogy to what I was talking about today, in which the skin is perceived of and sort of thematized as a sensitive interface between the body and the world. And that maybe tattoos work similarly. They are proclaiming a message to the world as that sort of, interface between self and world. That's something that you're carrying around with you as you go through the world. So that's one thing I would think about is a surface versus form. Permanence and impermanence is interesting. Do people who get tattoos think of them as permanent? That's a question I wonder. I mean, obviously, yes.
Yes.
Yeah, in some ways, yes, but I also wonder about, yeah. I mean, I think that's a really interesting question. How do you imagine that tattoo growing and changing with you as your body grows and changes and decays over time? I think that in a way, the neoclassical fashion I'm talking about thought of itself as a sort of strange hybrid of timeless and impermanent as well. On the one hand, it's imitating this marble, this sort of antique thing that has lasted through the ages. On the other hand, this is fashion that spoils immediately. It's white, it gets dirty, it gets torn, and the bodies of the ideal wearer are only sort of physically perfect for an instant, right? That's what I mean about being unforgiving. And in fact, there's a great treatise that I found from like 1819 that's looking back on the era of fashion, of neoclassical dress, and saying like, well, all these women, they thought they were looking like statues, but they didn't take into account the wear and tear of the weather and how that really ages you, and that these statues have aged, and that how sort of unattractive that is. So I think that there's, I don't know, I can't really wrap that up into a tidy bow, except to say that there's something there, both with tattoos and with neoclassical fashion, that is a sort of bid for immortality, but predicated on this very, decaying, quick, fleeting thing, which is the body and the things that you put on it.
I think we have time probably for this, may be our last question. From a staff member, quote, "Thank you for this fascinating talk. What do you think this current aesthetic draw to cottagecore and a return to natural homemade decor and fashion reflects about today's societal ideologies?"
I mean, the natural is a perennial attraction, I would say, since the 18th century. That's one thing that we have in common with the 1790s, is this valorization of things that are natural as being purer, more virtuous, and more worthwhile, and how we think of ourselves as, when we're in private and in nature, those are our true selves, as opposed to the sort of facades that we put on when we're in public. So I think that's something we share with the 18th century. Certainly this fascination with nature and with handcraftedness, I have to see it as a pandemic response, as a response to the tremendous alienation and fear that we've all felt, the isolation that we've all felt over the past year, the way we've felt at the mercy of forces that we can't control. That I know many of us have found refuge in taking long walks, in being in nature, in baking bread, in doing things with our hands that we can have a tangible sense of satisfaction and a little bit of pleasure in a world in which so many of our pleasures have been taken away. We can't go to the movies, we can't go out dancing, we can't see each other, we can't hug each other. Many of our social pleasures and things that make life worth living have been taken away. But these handcraftedness, these handcrafted pleasures and crafts are ways in which we can invest our energy and find some like reserve of joy. So I think that has been powerful in the past year for many people.
Thank you so much. Thank you for leaving this talk on a note to think about joy. Want to again remind everybody that Professor Amelia Rauser is the recipient of the Dewey Award in 2020. It's really delightful and wonderful to have your talk here today. Thank you for joining us. And there is a reception immediately following this Common Hour talk if you would like to speak further with Professor Rauser. I do believe that the Zoom link is in the chat for those of you who are able to attend. And it is now my task to say that it's 2:30. On to the next segment of your day, and I look forward to seeing you at Emily Quinn's talk. Emily Quinn, who's an intersex activist and artist, will be giving a talk next Wednesday at Common Hour. Thank you so much, Amelia.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody.